like that. Okay, we're good to go. Ed, it's all yours.
Ah, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Bird, sir.
And did you hear the news about good old General Mercer?
No.
You know Claremont Street.
Yeah.
They renamed it after him. The Mercer legacy is secure.
Sure.
All he had to do was die.
Yeah, that's a lot less work.
We ought to give it a try. Now, how you gonna get your debt plan through?
I guess I'm gonna finally have to listen to you.
Really?
Let's smile. Do whatever it takes to get my plan on the Congress floor.
And Madison and Jefferson are merciless.
Well, hate the sin, love the sinner.
Hamilton.
I'm sorry, Burr, I gotta go.
But
decisions are happening over dinner.
two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room diametrically opposed foes. They emerge with a compromise, having opened doors that were previously closed. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system he can shape however he wants. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital. And here's the pièce de résistance. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens. No one else is in the room where it happens. Thomas claims
Alexander was on Washington's doorstep one day in distress and disarray.
Thomas claims
Alexander said,
I've nowhere else to turn.
and basically begged me to join the fray.
Thomas claims
I approached Madison and said, I know you hate him, but let's hear what he has to say.
Thomas claims
Well, I arranged the meeting. I arranged the menu, the venue, the seating.
But no one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one really knows how the parties get to yes. The pieces that are sacrificed in every game of chess. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. Meanwhile, Madison is grappling with the fact that not every issue can be settled by committee. Meanwhile, Congress is fighting over where to put the capital. It isn't pretty. Then Jefferson approaches with the dinner and invite. Madison responds with Virginian insight.
Maybe we can solve one problem with another and win the victory for the Southerners. In other words, a quid pro quo.
I suppose.
Wouldn't you like to work a little closer to home?
Actually, I would.
Well, I propose the Potomac.
And you'll provide him his votes.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
Let's go.
No. What else was it? The room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. My God, it got to trust, but we never really know what got discussed. Click room where it happened, and no one else was in the room where it happened. Alexander Hamilton. What did they say to you to get you to sail New York City down the river? Alexander Hamilton. Did Washington know about the dinner? Was the presidential pressure to deliver? Alexander Hamilton. Did you know even then it doesn't matter where you put the U.S. capital?
Cause we'll have the banks. We're in the same spot.
You got more than you gave.
And I wanted what I got. When you got skin in the game, stay in the game. But you don't get a win unless you play in the game. Oh, you get love for it. You get hate for it. You get nothing if you wait for it, wait for it, wait. God help and forgive me. I want to build something that's gonna outlive me. What do you want, Bird? What do you want, Bird? You stand for nothing.
I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens, the room where it happens. Hold your nose and close your eyes. We don't get a say in what they trade away.
We dream of a brand new start.
But we dream in the dark for the most part. Dark as a dream where it happens. I've got to be in the
Good afternoon. My name is Ed Ingebretsen. I want to thank everyone for joining us, not in that room, but in, say, a room where we might talk a little bit about how Hamilton happened and what Hamilton left us. And the first thing I want to say this afternoon is to hope that everyone in hearing is healthy and safe, and that what we're doing here today will provide some kind of history, an unscrubbed history. The District of Columbia was created, and this was kind of Hamilton's point, to demonstrate the political might of the new nation's slaver power. The Constitution had been ratified the previous year, and their federal city's 10 square miles of land was deeded purposely from two slaver states, Maryland and Virginia. This examination this afternoon of the laws, practices, social customs, and persons that make the federal city is a part of a wider project examining Anglo-colonial race apartheid. Enslaved Washington is intended to be a walking tour of the district. Someday we will. Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, also documented as the Natchitoches, and over time neighboring the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. We acknowledge them as I start. Some necessary background, and the red is kind of the theory, and I'm going to ask you to put up a little bit with me on that. We're going to be looking at, from 1790 until about 1810 or 15, the origins of the federal city, which was again given the nickname of the District of Columbia. We're going to look at the traffic in humans. You sometimes know about it as the domestic slavery. Actually, I would prefer to actually not use the word slavery and to talk about enslaved persons, or to talk about the traffic in persons, which is what we're talking about. And in the third section, I'd like to address slave power, the Constitution and the presidents, the power of words, how enslavement never starts with chains, it always starts with words. And we'll look how the people lived, the enslaved people in the district and in the capital. We'll look at different buildings, persons, places. One of the things that I will be talking about throughout this is that for over the last 150 years, Washington, D.C. has been busily rebuilding itself. And I think, and I'm going to argue that in part because they're trying to hide a history that even in 1790 was shameful and they didn't quite know what to do with it. And we'll end with people, and some of the people are surprising. Frederick Douglass and Tubman and Banneker and Obama, who he's a mixed race president, we call him black. That's as much politics as anything else, and it's a question that I will ask about. And also we'll talk a little bit about some history noted to him. We'll look at the case for reparations. I'm going to specifically speak about Georgetown, since Georgetown is respectably doing something to archaeology, its own history of enslavement. Cultures are structures. They're materials, their words, their actions, their habits. Cultures lock in memory as stones lock in heat. Cultures have a gravitational weight. Histories cast shadows. We, each of us, alone and together, walk in patterned light and dark. What we do this afternoon is a partial look at the shadow of the federal city, nicknamed when it started in 1790 as the Congo of the America because of the vast number of enslaved African captives required to build it. We'll look at the slave pit and the auction blocks, Wisconsin Street, O Street, Northwest Georgetown. We'll look at the enslaved remains in Georgetown. And we can ask ourselves, why are there 5 or 6 all Black churches in Georgetown University, Georgetown, and very few actually Black Georgetownians historically? Mount Zion Cemetery, the end of the Underground Railroad for some, the start in the other place. We'll look at a place that we now call the Dean and DeLuca, which was in 1795 a different kind of place. We'll look at the Capitol, the camp of enslaved workers not far from where Mr. Obama made his office and his oath. We'll look at Howard University, the first real congressional reparations in 1867. We'll look at the DC Blue Jug prison, where persons who were escaped enslaved were returned under brutal conditions and left there. We now know it as the Building Museum. Look at Roby's slave pen, which if you know the 12 years as a slave is a notorious place. And Beatty's auction block, if you know the Georgetown Theater, that's what it is now. Beatty's auction block for enslaved is now the Georgetown Theater. We'll look at the Washington Memorial, the Yellow House slaver pen, quarried and built by the enslaved. We looked at Thomas Jefferson, who owned 600 enslaved persons, including 6 or 7 who were his own children. Georgetown Harbor, which was in 1790 one of the major places for doing commerce, and not accidentally one of the reasons that George Washington himself with a plantation, himself with cotton, himself with an enslaved person, and himself with a distillery, he needed water. We're going to begin this afternoon actually looking at the canal systems in Washington, D.C., because it's important. We're going to think about the survey district designed by enslaved Banneker, a freed Black person, son of an enslaved woman, who self-taught nonetheless was the man chosen to do the surveying. The presentation considers an archaeology of the federal city, and I like that word. Who built it? Out of what stolen materials? What remains visible? And by stolen materials, I include, of course, the land, as well as the shadows in which all of us still walk. And by rights, my presentation begins before the colonialists, of course, and I acknowledge the weight of our colonizing history, carried by the native peoples of the lands that became the federal city. So throughout this afternoon, what happens to these persons? In any history, what happens to us? Africans were 25% of the population in 1800. Majority of them were enslaved. The federal city derives its name Congo of America from this initial population of enslaved persons who surveyed, dug, transported stone, who built the city in the 10-year period allotted by Congress. My usage here, and I should say, I don't use African American unless I use European American. I will use African when I can say that these men, women, and children were brought into this country by force against their will from Africa. But after 1710, probably the majority of the enslaved persons were 1715. The majority of the enslaved persons were 2nd or 3rd or 4th generation American. I will call them Black Americans. And everything but name, they were citizens. The district basically briefly held home rule following the end of the war between the states. But in the early 1870s, the number of Black citizens assuming authority in DC caused Congress to eliminate home rule. One of my enduring questions will be the politics of lack of representation, and already one begins to see the shadow. By 1975, Black Americans were demographically and culturally leading the city with more than 70% of the population. Axiomatic. Soft power, the congratulatory and demeaning methods used to elevate those who lack material power or who lack access to material power by flattering them as great nonetheless. Praising DC as the quote, Black capital, Black cultural capital is an example of soft power. My presentation is not about soft power. To the contrary, it's about how Washington, DC still moves in chains, enslaved and powerless, its citizens of all ethnicities without representation still. No surprise here. This is the power of enslavement and the display of that power that Hamilton memorializes and that the federal city was intended to be. Here's an example of soft power. And when I'm finished here today and you decide to get on the Google and start looking some of these things up, and you start reading histories of Washington, D.C., and it will shock you how infrequent the word enslaved or slavery is. Soft power. Unique among cities with a high percentage of African Americans, Washington has had a significant Black population since the city's creation. Not a word mentioned about the conditions of what that population lived in. As a result, Washington became both a center of African American culture and a center of civil rights. These italics are mine. That's an example of what I call soft power. Since the city government was run by the US federal government, Black and white school teachers were paid in an equal scale as workers of the federal government. Somewhat true, but nonetheless, what they're not saying is that at the same time, most of the city was segregated. It was not until the administration of Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat, who had numerous Southerners in his cabinet, that federal offices and workplaces were segregated, started in 1913. What they don't say here is that what has been segregated and what is legally apartheid are the public schools, transportation, and many other public situations in Washington, D.C. And that in fact, it was a Sharp versus Bowling, one of DC's own school district that was presented to the Supreme Court in 1954. So the segregation and apartheid in Washington, D.C. is noteworthy. The city was racially segregated in certain facilities until the 1950s. And they don't mention the fact that this was indeed one of the schools. So DC remains to this day a commonwealth of unrepresented citizens, mostly Black, segregated by social practice and by apartheid, that is by law. The district is white because it has been scrubbed white. This is an unscrubbed history of that, impartial. We began this afternoon with I Want to Be in the Room, the origins of the federal city, you know Hamilton's versions of that, 1790 and 1793. The US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation over such district not exceeding 10 miles square. What it doesn't remind you of, I think Hamilton may allude to it, that the reason the Congress felt that they needed their own land for the city because the revolutionary soldiers were trying to get paid from Congress and Congress didn't have the money. So they threatened the Congress in Pennsylvania. Congress said, no, we can't depend upon any other state to protect us. We need our own state. They couldn't even pay their own bills at the time. But I begin, as I said earlier, by acknowledging that the land, to quote Robert Frost, was not ours, that we have the Potawatomi, you have the Piscataway, you have the Natchitoches, Anacostia, Georgetown itself sits on a Choctaw village called Tahoga. These are the original users of the land, and it's to those persons that we at least pause with some respect. Another soft history is John Smith, and remember John Smith from Pocahontas fame, 1612. This was written about his map, and it says something. His masterpiece map of Virginia, 1612, remained in active use for 7 decades and opened the part of North America to European exploration, settlement, and trade. You notice
Hey Ed, this is Robert. Just real quick, can you slide your arrow down? That's on the left side of the screen. There you go. Perfect. It was blocking some of the picture. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, never. Thank you for interrupting. I think most of us know the story of John Smith from Pocahontas. What we don't know, we pay very little attention to the fact that Pocahontas, who was first kidnapped, then married to an Englishman, and then carried back into England, baptized as Rebecca. So that the enslaved history that we're talking about here did not simply start in Washington, D.C. as much as it did in this whole particular area. You can this is the Potomac here, this is the Potomac, and this was the Pamplon. So you have the 4 rivers here. This was an original map, and they used it for very numbers of years to remind ourselves that there were 7 or 8 distinct tribes of indigeneity in the area still. The Congressional Organic Act of 1801, here we come specifically to the topic of the District of Columbia, organizes the District of Columbia to be under the exclusive control of Congress because, as a matter of fact, the government in Pennsylvania was not protecting Congress, and it was in Philadelphia, from the soldiers who wanted pay. What you're going to be looking at here is, this is the area that we're looking through here. It's Maryland and Virginia. The question that we're going to have is why these particular states were chosen. The Black surveyor of the federal city, who had issues with Jefferson's enslavement of folks, Benjamin Banneker, African-American, mathematician, surveyor, astronomer, self-taught. He wrote a now famous letter to Jefferson. He argues However variable we may be in society or religion, however diversified in situation or color, we're all the same family and stand in the same relationship to him. Jefferson replies, "Thank you sincerely for your letter of the 19th instantly and for the almanac it contained. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit." I will spend more time with Jefferson later, so I won't spend a lot of time here. What's interesting, the image of that you see is Banneker's image, and it's in the district archives. You'll see that he's off to one side and that the white persons who were actually Washington and Madison and Jefferson are the ones that are actually doing the kind of planning. When they were building and planning this, he was in a tent and they were in buildings as they constructed the building. So Washington chooses the exact site along the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, and the city was officially founded in 1790 after both Maryland and Virginia, slaver states, ceded land to a new district. These are Jefferson's notes. Okay. One of the things to pay attention to here is how Georgetown and Alexandria were the two largest harbors at the time. Alexandria since 1746, excuse me, had been one of the primary enslaved state areas for the departure and the loading of cargo of enslaved persons. Georgetown, likewise. Georgetown then would be two particular words, Georgetown. Washington and Jefferson were the ones who chose the site. And you know the story from Hamilton. It was a compromise. The North wanted the South and the federal government to pick up the Revolutionary War debt so they could pay the soldiers. And the South wanted a capital closer to here, which they got. So Hamilton's "I Wanted to Be in the Room" talks about that compromise. It talks about how the South gets what it wants. It gets a demonstrable show of enslaved power. It gets a capital right on the border of Maryland and Virginia, and the North gets their debts picked up. Something we'll look at a little later. Do you ever wonder why the District of Washington looks the way it does? It's like X, my X. I get rid of my X and it comes back to me as mine. So in the shadow here, you're going to see the shadow of enslavement, because at one particular point, just before the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law took effect, Virginia, then now making most of its state's economy on enslavement, not cotton, not tobacco, but the buying and selling of enslaved persons. This is Virginia. It said, we can't stay in the District of Columbia if, in fact, District of Columbia is going to be eliminating the buying and selling of enslaved persons. District of Columbia does not yet end enslavement in the district. What it does end is the selling of enslavement, or buying and selling, partly because it had been such an affront for so many people. They would rather Virginia do it quietly by themselves. So a small fact, you can go here now to Virginia, right down here off the harbor, and you can see the District of Columbia marker. And if you go around the district, you'll see one of these. And if this were a walking tour, we could do that, but this is not going to be a walking tour. So what does history teach? History teaches that the buying and selling of enslaved persons was the rationale for the federal city's location. Here are two quotes. And I have recommendations for things to read on these. Carried Me Back by Doyle is on the, we'll see an image of that later. He says, Virginia's, quote, entire economy was based on the institution of chattel slavery, quote. Understand that after the colonists had, in a sense, used up the land on tobacco, and cotton wasn't able to be farmed in Virginia, that the buying and selling of enslaved persons north and south then became Virginia's economy. And Thomas Jefferson will talk about this. In a review of Doyle, he writes, influential Virginia politicians worked to close the slave trade in 1807, in part to drive competitors out of the slaving, and thereby increase the value of their human commodities. Politicians from the Old Dominion led the way in acquiring Louisiana, Thomas Jefferson, a region that became the eventual home to many Chesapeake enslaved. A gruesome stew of greed, racism, brutality helped create a substantial interstate enslaved trade by 1812. The date on that is particular, 1812. You're going to find that 1807, the international slave trade was ended by law, by Congress. And part of that, because they began to see, as we see, this my second point here, the international traffic and enslavement could be ended without economic difficulty because the domestic buying and selling of humans, exporting enslaved persons south from Maryland and Virginia could replace the loss. This was a major economic activity in the US until the 1860s. The district was the staging point, north to south, south to north. I should say the cotton gin. In 1789, with the ratification of the Constitution, it was thought that enslavement was going to end. Thought that states were beginning to close down. The northern states were beginning to veto their enslavement laws because cotton farming was not economic. It needed too many people to do it. The cotton gin, the discovery and the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, suddenly reopened the possibility of the economic use of the cotton gin for the manufacturing of cotton. And we're going to see that in a minute, the surprising consequences that might have. The domestic buying and selling of Black persons in the US distributed the Black American population throughout the South in a migration that greatly surpassed in volume the Atlantic slave trade to North America. A figure that one hears, the Middle Passage was 12 million African captives, and that in the southern and northern buying and selling, you had something like 8 million persons, all of whom were born here in this country. The point in red, I think, are worth taking. Congress outlaws the importation of kidnapped enslaved, but the slave population in the US nearly tripled over the next 50 years, from 1807 to 1857. 1857, cotton is king, Southern senator said in Congress. No one is going to thwart us. The domestic buying and selling of humans continued into the 1860s. It removed by force approximately 1.2 million men, women, and children from home and family. The vast majority of these persons were born in the United States after the last importation of African captives. And indeed, by 1850, most US enslaved were third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. The title of this book, Carry Me Back, is going to refer to something we'll see here in a minute. What I would like to focus here is not so much the graphs, but the passages, the red lines, and you can kind of see the movement. You can see the movement to the southwest. You can see the movement into Florida from the north. And I should say this about the north. The north, we often attribute the enslavement as an issue for the South, and that we in the north had nothing to do with it. As a matter of fact, the northern manufacturers took the products of the South, be it liquor, be it sugar for the liquor, and cotton for linen for their manufacturers. So there was as much transporting of enslaved persons and indigene, Native Americans, if you want to call them that, starting way before 1619. But the pattern that you see here is a two-way pattern, but that much of the movement is from the east into the west, a point that you'll see. And in the 1840s to the federal city, 300,000 enslaved persons were transported south. Typically, they were marched south, they weren't transported. And during each decade between 1810 and 1860, at least 100,000 enslaved persons were removed from their homelands. And I use words like homeland because it is their homelands. These are families that were broken up, and whatever label we might want to call them for without a justification, this was human trafficking. In the final decade alone, before the Civil War, 350,000 lives were uprooted. All these persons were born, raised, and died in the United States. They were citizens in every way except legal caste. Two important things here to pay attention to. I want you to see the two maps on the left. Notice the top is the movement of enslaved in the colonies. The lower one is the movement of enslaved. Red is the movement south, or the movement is a decrease, and the green is an increase. You'll see that in the bottom, the movement and the transport of enslaved persons triples in the United States, not the colonies. So that enslavement as an economic and a political reality actually triples after the ratification of the Constitution. And you'll notice over on the map on the right, the purple space. Florida, you see, way at the bottom. 1819, the US acquires Florida from Spain. And you see the two brown areas that you're looking at in the center where the indigene were moved from. The two in the center were lands that were deeded to the indigene by federal governments. They were moved through the Indian Removal Act in 1830. They were moved to that area of the purple area. We'll talk about that here right now. The Indian Removal Act. Suddenly it became clear that the land that had been given to the indigene, the Cherokee specifically, was land that was arable and could be used for cotton now that they had a new economic way of doing this. Therefore, the Indians had to be removed. They were removed west in 1830, a direct consequence of the traffic in enslaved persons. In the southern post-cotton-gin economic need for places to grow cotton and for labor to produce it. The indigene had to go despite federal promises to the tribes. And Andrew Jackson is the president at the time. We'll come back to Andrew Jackson in a bit because he is part of the story all the way through. And again, the southern post-cotton-gin economic need only is matched by the northern post-cotton-gin economic need because the North, as I said, is profiting from the products being picked. July 9th, 2020, there's that shape again. There's that funny purple shape. Andrew Jackson, politics are not just a historical problem. This is the court, Supreme Court. Justice Neil Gorsuch, speaking of the majority. Today, we are asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold government to its word. Supreme Court rules that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. The enslavement that we're talking about and the politics that we're talking about then, these are not issues that are simply just appeared now. They're not issues from the past that are just dead and we're not paying any attention to them, but that the movement of persons and our use of this land is an ongoing problem that at least has to be addressed and looked at. In 1828, Isaac Franklin and John Armfield leased this brick building on Duke Street in Alexandria. And we probably passed it 100 times and never paid any attention to it. And it's now called the Freedom Museum. By the 1830s, Franklin and Armfield often sold 1,000 people annually, operating as one of the largest slave and trading companies in the United States until 1836. A Duke Street property operated properly until 1861. And it was always done far enough away from anything public so that people weren't really being aware. But at this time, remember, this is still the District of Columbia. And it wasn't until 1846 that Alexandria becomes retroceded back to Virginia. Matthew Brady, you know, the photographer. This is the rear staging ground for Franklin and Armfield's slaver pen in Alexandria. This is an 1860 photograph. You can see the people lined up, again, out of sight of the front street. It's shocking when you think about it. Many of the enslaved were children. Male, age 11, Bill Keeley. Elizabeth, female, age 10, height 4'1". Monroe, male, age 12, height 4'7". These are very little people. These are people that we would look at today and we would have some issues, we have more than some issues with it. Robert, male, age 12, height 4'4", Mary, female, age 11, Some have last names, some do not have last names. Most of the names are probably made up. As many as a million people passed through the district between 1828 and 1861 on their way to bondage in Mississippi and Louisiana. And they were not taken on buses, they were not taken on trains, they were not taken in public transportation, they walked. They walked in coffles. They were chained by the foot at the neck, and they walked back and forth up and down major streets, and we'll see that. You see the ad there, cash for 500 Negroes, putting both sexes from 12 to 25 years of age. This is 150 years ago. This is not a long time ago. In 1820, an enslaved child in the upper South had 30% chance of being sold south by 1860. Left and right, collar used to domesticate animal or enslaved human in 1840. The date on this collar, 1857, the inscription on the collar, quote, horses, mules, and dark African niggers, inscribed on the collar, 1857. Carry me back to old Virginia. So when one asks, in what kind of culture is a tune, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, which is sung in the persona of an elderly male slave who has been sold south, in what kind of culture does this become a state song? Is it a kind of culture where a governor, for however much he can apologize, still feels confident enough as a 21-year-old, 25-year-old in medical school to have the kind of privilege to be able to dress up in costume? Yes, perhaps it's funny to them, but humor always represents a kind of anxiety. And clearly it is a culture that, well, we didn't see anything wrong with it. Well, maybe there's something wrong with that. Okay. But again, to remind ourselves that this is not simply a Southern problem. North and South each profited. The word stock, of course, reminds us where the word comes from, livestock. The stock market in 1711, New York, quote, law appointing a place for the more convenient hiring of slaves. And by the way, in 1711, New York had the most slaves of any of the northern states. The law reads, be it ordained by the mayor, recorder, alderman, assistants of the city of New York, convened in common council, hereby ordained by the authority of the same, that all Negro and Indian slaves that are left out to hire within the city do take up their standing in order to be hired at the market house at the Wall Street slip until such time as they are hired. We pause here to remind ourselves again, the indigeny, the buying and selling of indigenous persons is part of the conversation that needs to be addressed and at least looked at and understood. This was as much done starting in Massachusetts with the Pequots and the King Philip's War, and certainly for the 100 years, 125 years from the time that Christopher Columbus took 5 boats of indigenous persons from the islands back to Spain. Whereby all persons may know where to hire slaves as their occasions shall require, and also masters discover when their slaves are so hired, and all the inhabitants of the city are to be taken notice accordingly. A lot of this is heavy stuff, and we think about this, and when you start putting ages and dates and sizes and weights and names, and sometimes the first name and sometimes the last name, and you suddenly begin to realize that, well, these are persons, and how is it that a country, Hamilton, can, what's the skin in the game here? What color is that particular skin? How did we go from the colonies of British persons, all of whom were not British yet, but English persons who were very much prizing liberty and freedom? How did we get to the particular place? So we look at slaver power and the presidents, and we think about why the federal city was moved from New York to Georgetown Harbor. It was moved partly, as I said, from, you see this from Hamilton, that they needed war debt picked up. The South wasn't going to pick up the war debt. The North needed, and the South wanted a show of enslaved power. The 1619 Project makes the point that the Constitution, that basically the states were, the Constitution was written to protect slavery. There is some truth to that. I would change the focus and the emphasis on the way it was written. But as a matter of fact, the Constitution never mentions the word enslaved. It will always talk about held to service. It was the international slave trade was part of the compromise. It was going to end in 1807. Thomas Jefferson signed the bill that ended the international slave trade. There's some complications here. Part of them is Jefferson himself, his own politics, his own enslavement, and also the fact that they could, at that particular point, end the enslaved trade from Africa, because as a matter of fact, the domestic increase, we saw this earlier, that the movement of enslavement was 3 times in the States, 3 times the number in the States as it was in the colonies. Enslavement ends with chains. It does not begin with them. Words do the work. Whenever we want to do violence to somebody and don't choose to claim responsibility for it, we use language, because weapons are weapons, words are weapons, and they enforce power. Prior to the war between the states, I don't say civil war, I say war between the states, because no war is civil. Protected by the US Constitution, 8 serving presidents owned enslaved persons and brought them to the White House. Words provided wealth for the white elite, North and South. Approximately 1 in 4 Southern families held enslaved persons prior to the war between the states. These words of power are protected. According to an 1860 US census, there were about 385,000 enslaved owners of enslavement out of a white population of enslaved states, approximately 7 million. One wonders why you have the image and the metaphor of the happy darky and Aunt Jemima and always the singing and the dancing and Jim Crow. Someone needed to not pay attention to the fact that the number of enslaved persons vastly outnumbered the ones and the owners. And so part of the great fear of enslavement was how to manage a population that they thought that any minute was going to, and very often did, uprise. Here's Hamilton's America. For 50 of the 72 years between the election of George Washington, a slaver, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, a slaver was president of the United States. During that period, only a slave keeper would be a 2-term president. 12 of the first 18 US presidents enslaved individuals at some point, and 9 brought enslaved persons into the White House. A majority of the founders of the United States enslaved people. 41 of the 56 signatories on the Declaration of Independence. 25 of the 55 men who wrote the US Constitution. And then there's the curious case of Thomas Jefferson, slaver, founder, guilty author of the Declaration. And I say guilty author because he's writing it with Monroe, his enslaved son by Sally, who was 14 years old when he began his relationship with her. The boy is actually acting as his valet. All men are created equal. Do you think he thinks about the kid? Do you think he thinks about the other children at home? Do you think he thinks about either the woman who's cooking him dinner in his kitchen, Martha, or her half-sister who's 3/4 European, enslaved, who's his, how do you say it politely, his object on the side? First Secretary of State, architect of the federal city. He certainly had lots of interests. With Sally Hemings, he fathered 5, maybe 6 enslaved children whom he never legally freed. Some he, quote, let go when they turned 21, but he never put a pen to paper for reasons that became very clear. He never wanted to acknowledge in public that he had these children, this relationship. He has status as the author of the most sacred document in the US canon, and I alluded to that just a moment ago, but nothing is more certain that Jefferson did not intend that Black people should be free in America. This may surprise folks. The Jefferson Memorial, panel 3, offers a quotation from his autobiography. It edits Jefferson, panel 3, on this very point by omitting a crucial portion, we see below in blue, of Jefferson. And this is what Jefferson writes. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. What is not put in the memorial Nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. It's Thomas Jefferson. And his conclusions here are not pleasant, so I'm not going to repeat them here in this public. Read the Notes on Virginia if you want to have a bit more background on Jefferson. Sally Hemings, half sister of Jefferson's wife. You figure out the biology of this. It's too complicated. Martha. Hemings would have been 3/4 European. She was enslaved. I'm going to go back here. She was 14 when he began his relationship with her. One can hardly call it a relationship because on any number of grounds, what would we do with someone who was, I would call them all kinds of things, but somebody with somebody who was underage in that respect, to use an expression. And is there any kind of agency at all? I mean, the people who study Hemings say that she stayed with him out of the promise that he was going to free their children, which he did not. She outlived him. She still wasn't given her freedom. She was given her time, which meant she was still enslaved, but she was allowed to basically spend the last couple of years of her life. And after Jefferson's death in the 1820s, she was allowed to basically assume a role as a person of her own agency, although, as I said, she was still technically his enslaved. Jefferson's politics are shaped by his economy. In 1819, worried by an increase in infant mortality among his enslaved, Jefferson believed that it was, quote, moral and as well as interested considerations that overseers should preserve slaves' lives, not for their labor, but their increase. In his diaries, he was an infatigable diary, he notes that he made a significant profit from every year from the birth of slave children. In the red, I allow nothing for losses by death, but on the contrary, shall presently take credit 4% per annum for the increase over and above keeping up their numbers. In other words, his slaves were yielding Jefferson a perpetual human dividend at compound interest. Jefferson's social practice differed from his politics. Sally Hemings, again, white half-sister of Martha, enslaved mixed race. They had at least 5 children, according to DNA studies, and the Jefferson Institute for years denied any amount of this. It was only until in the late 90s, and Madison Hemings, who, when you wonder where the name Madison came from, Madison Hemings said back very early on that he had this history and no one ever paid any attention to him. So Jefferson has about 267 relatives that we know of now. The man on the left, on the right picture on the right, Shannon Lanier, a 6th grade grandchild of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. He is a newscaster in Houston, and you may know him, or you certainly may know this piece. This was an opinion piece in Newsweek after the killing of Mr. Floyd. I'm a descendant of President Jefferson. Take his public statues down. I'm the 6th great grandson of President Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner. I'm a descendant through his relationship with his enslaved Sally Hemings. Despite my connection, he falls under the above description. There are many statues of him that should come down, who's, after all, a participant in the institution of enslavement. Perhaps the most notorious one among the founding fathers, not least because of the jarring contrast between what he practiced and what he preached. That's all background, and as depressing as all that is, and to understand some of the history of it, and there's much more than this brief snapshot of persons and places that I'm walking through, but just to kind of to put into practice that the colonies became states with a compromise in the Constitution of the United States that saw for the elimination of the international slave trade in 20 years, 1807. It was argued that what did you do with enslavement in the Constitution? Well, it doesn't really mention it in the Constitution. So the kind of argument was, well, we can do this and eventually enslavement will go away. there's some sense that enslavement as a political practice was beginning to eliminate in the late 1880s and 1780s and 1790s. The cotton gin in the years between 1800 and 1830 changed that around. So now we come to the federal city itself, the home of the oppressed. What you see here, a couple things I want to draw our attention to because we will see these buildings as we go along over here. The building in the background is the Capitol. This was the Capitol that was built after the British burned it in 1813. The Capitol, you'll see the what is actually a copper dome on the building. Why that's interesting, because you'll see that later in 1856 when that burns down and they're building another one. All of the building of these buildings is being done by the persons that you see in the front. What you're looking at is a coffle. A coffle is chained humans. You see male and you see female and you see children. They're chained by the leg and they're chained by the neck. And as you can see that they are walking through in front of the Congress itself. The point of Hamilton and the point of the compromise and the point of the skin in the game and the point of moving the capital from New York, where George Washington started in the Federalists, when they moved into the new land of the federal city, was precisely to flaunt the power of the enslavement economy that kept the nation together. It's hard to argue this, and we'll see as we go further more. This particular image that you will see will later be picked up in famous abolitionist blasts that we'll see. In fact, here it is. They call it the slave market of America, and you see three columns, and you see on the top one you have on the top left you have a reading of the Declaration of Independence, and on the top right you have the image of the Capitol that we just saw, and the center you have a kind of a rudimentary map then of enslavement in Washington D.C. In the second level you see on the far left Alexandrian jail. On the far right, you see a young woman and her child being held captive in the Washington jail, what we call the Blue Jug, which becomes now known as the building memorial. In the center, you see an enslaved auction. Usually, the enslaved auctions were persons unclad on the auction block. So here, probably for the sake of the publicity, where it was of the tract, they were put in dresses, they're clothed. And on the bottom, you see the famous slave pen in Alexandria on the far right and on the left. And you see the harbors of Alexandria. It's not to be understood as that the two harbors, Alexandria and Georgetown, we know them now as the waterfronts, and we can go down there and we can see the Georgetown Harbor, and you see National Harbor. And all of this enslavement happened at these places, and that's what put this map, Federal City, on the map. This is a broadside from the Brooklyn Historical Society. It's interesting as we see it. Every state had an enslaved code, and I don't have the time here to talk about the different kinds of slavery. In the Caribbean colonial enslavement was much harsher than the Anglo states enslavement for lots of different reasons, partly because the Anglo-Caribbean had been doing this since 1495 with the indigene, and so they had a system down that Virginia. So when Virginia talks about, my people, my community, and they're our family, they are trying to put a finer spin on things that they didn't have. But every state had a slavery code. The District of Columbia, this one here you see, was dated 1862. So this particular edition of the slavery code is actually voided, because in DC, by virtue of the 1850 Compromise, which brings California into the Union as a free state, also eliminates the buying and selling of enslavement in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia itself eliminates enslavement. Lincoln signs the law in 1862, 8 months before his Emancipation Proclamation. This is not Lincoln's law. This was written by a senator from Massachusetts, actually. You see Georgetown in the background. The DC law, and I'm going to spend a moment here with this, the DC law offered compensation to the owners. None of these laws, and this is what you see on the left, is a bill of sale in which someone came and said, these are the enslaved that I lost, and I demand, or I request compensation for them. So compensation for the enslavement never actually addressed the enslaved persons themselves. So when we actually start doing a kind of a walking tour, and before we want to talk about this, the Louisiana Purchase opened the South and the cotton gin, exploded the possibilities for industrial cotton production. So the reason that you began to see this increase of enslaved persons going up and down through Washington, DC, was partly because of that economics. Here in Georgetown, for example, we're going to begin to actually see some buildings. One man was doing some work in his particular house, and at the bottom, he actually writes about this. He says, but somehow I could not leave them. Who were these people? How did they come to be in my house? He finds bones in his basement. Why are there all 5 all-Black churches flourishing in Georgetown today, but fewer than 10 Black inhabitants left in the current population of 4,800? Good question. The Georgia Penn, Oak Street, Northwest. On the right, you see the red brick. That's the back wall of the CVS, and you can kind of see over by the red cone, the original stone of the building that you see on the left. If you walk up and down Wisconsin, I don't think you'll ever be the same thing again. This was a notorious slave auction in Georgetown. And Georgetown at the time was Georgetown. So the Georgetown Theater was originally the Beatty slave auction. This was an ad that was in the paper. Negroes wanted. Persons wishing to dispose of Negroes from 10 to 25 years of age, both sexes, can obtain the cash for them by applying to the subscriber. 2 doors east of the Union Tavern stage office, Bridge Street, Georgetown. A smart, likely girl, 11 to 13, would be desirable. We know this is Dina DeLuca. 1795 was a famous auction market for enslaved in the basement. Eventually it was torn down, and we have this building here. Georgetown College, 1789, and there's a couple of reasons why this image is here. 1789, the founding of Georgetown, and I teach at Georgetown, so this is kind of partly truth in advertising, that 1789, that was also the year that the federal government ratified the Constitution. So if you see the state seal, the school seal of Georgetown, it very much models the 1789 federal. The image on the right, war between the states, soldiers in Virginia, you can see Georgetown in the back. Now remember, in 1860, where these soldiers are is now no longer the district, it is now Arlington. So the movement back and forth between the land that was once part of the district, we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay. Frank Campbell, one of 272 enslaved persons, sold to keep Georgetown University in 1838. The 2 children never had names. In red, this is the president of the university. Then he would be called one of the Catholic gentlemen of America, which was the name in Maryland that the Jesuits were incorporated under, since they could not be known as, they could not incorporate as priests. But Father Mileti was the president. Know all men by these presidents that I, Thomas F. Mileti of Georgetown, District of Columbia, have bargained and sold, and by these presidents do bargain, sell and deliver under Henry Johnson of the parish of St. James, state of Louisiana, the following Negroes. Building Mileti, which is a building I actually once lived in for a while at Georgetown University, its name has been changed because of this reference. When you move from Georgetown into the federal district itself, and I'm gonna spend a little time here. Georgetown was the farthest settlement up the navigable Potawatomi River, and Potawatomi is the tribe of the area. The canal seen here in this early photograph would be a major source of the profit of enslaved persons in the federal city. On the left, you have the C&O Canal. On the right, you have what would then be called the Washington Canal, which was finished in 1850. You see the western terminus, and when we get some close-ups of that, you'll see that the western terminus is right now about where the Washington Monument is. The Navy Yard terminus, we'll see what's left of this. But what's interesting, when you want to look across the C&O Canal, perhaps you have walked up and down it or know people that have, but when you can see in the distance over the bridge, you can see the federal city. And this was in 1860, so this is exactly right during the middle of as the situation for the war was heating up. The original Washington Canal, and I'm going to spend these first few slides here on the movement of water because water is one of the reasons the federal city is where it is at, because they enslaved the profit in moving merchandise and chattel property. So the original Washington Canal would be what we would call, you see it at the top of the map, Constitution Avenue now. And on the right, it angles off down into Southwest Harbor. Most of this is being built by enslaved. You'll see on the very edge on the left side of the photograph, the Washington Monument. And you can imagine, if you've been there, that there's a whole piece of land with Potomac Flats that's there now that wasn't here at this particular time in 1815. But the point and the reason that this is, number one, the enslaved persons built these. This is the original on the right. You have the original stone house that's on 17th and Constitution at the moment. You can see on the lower right, you see the end of the Washington Canal in the Navy Yard. And on the far side, you see a map and you see the Washington you see where the original canal would have ended. So that it was the linking of the harbor at Georgetown to the federal city and through it that made for the economy of enslavement. You see the canal where what right now would be Constitution. We'll talk about the Smithsonian here. The Smithsonian was built in 1848, began at the same time that 77 enslaved persons were trying to escape from Washington in what they call the Pearl Incident. So it was, and the enslaved, the Smithsonian actually was built by enslaved persons who were owned at one point by Martha Washington. They were part of her dowry. You see in the background the not yet completed Washington Monument. You see Georgetown way on the far side. Okay. When Washington was initially designed, the land that we now know as West and East Potomac Park was a tidal wetland, Potomac Flats. This is in 1863, right smack in the middle of the war, taken from the Smithsonian Castle Tower. You can see the distant, I'm going to actually point to it, the Washington Monument that's not yet complete. The point that I'm spending here with this is that all of this busyness is being done by enslaved persons, and all that was done was to increase the commerce, that this might have been a federal city, but as a matter of fact, it was designed to be for Georgetown and Alexandria, two major consumer centers for the buying and selling of enslaved persons. Martha Washington, the question about enslaved persons being involved in the construction of the Smithsonian. Black Americans worked in the construction of most early buildings in Washington, D.C., including the Capitol, and we'll see the White House. They rarely received any monetary compensation. They would, however, be rented and their owners would take the profit. That is to say, they weren't being sent out to the fields for sugar or for cotton or for anything else. So really, when enslaved persons had work, they rented out as they were in New York, and they became laborers. Frederick Douglass was rented out. That's how he learned to read. This is an 1848 image. Martha Washington, you see a picture of Mount Vernon here on the left, a drawing of Mount Vernon. Martha Washington's family, George Washington freed his 100 enslaved persons when he died on his will. The ones that he had given to his wife, Martha, were not freed. They were largely the ones who worked in the mill in Maryland, and who were then the ones responsible for doing the quarrying. So the enslaved family is owned by Martha Custis Washington at Mount Vernon. She was his wife. At the same time, we have the building of the Smithsonian in 1848. At the same time, an event that rattled and sent shockwaves. 77 adult enslaved persons, and the largest mass, how do you say it? The largest mass escape from enslaved persons happened in Washington, D.C., right down the street from 7th Street in what we now call the Southwest Harbor. And on the left, you see, on the right, you see from the mayor of Washington telling people not to be alarmed, that we'll catch them and we'll return them, and your property, it says at one point, your property will be safe. You can see that where DC and where Maryland is, that the Pearl with 77 enslaved men and women and children made it down the harbor to Point Lookout before they were brought back. They were brought back, they were held at a blue jug, they were then sold south. And selling an enslaved person south went from the quote, the more familial kind of enslavement that Virginia would tell us it was doing, into the harsher realities of Caribbean Anglo enslavement in Georgia. A better image of what you're seeing here. So you can kind of see the building and the Washington Harbor, the Smithsonian. This is all 1848. This is 1856, this image. The Bruin and Hill Company, located at 1707 Duke Street, is where this particular monument here is in Alexandria, which was in 1848, 2 years returned to Alexandria. So the monument of the Edmondson sisters, whom you see over here, you see the Edmondson sisters here after they had been returned and bought their freedom with Frederick Douglass at the 1850 Fugitive Slave Conference. It was a notorious story, and they had these all six of the children were purchased for $4,500. Enslaved built the Washington Monument, which, as you know, or you may not know, it had 2 phases, and you can look at it now and you can kind of see that the lower half has a different stone than the top one. The private one, 1848 to 1854, would have been primarily using enslaved persons. By 1876, they probably had many of these same persons doing the work. Traffic on the National Mall. Some of these stories people may know. We will have passed these sites many times. The National Mall sits on the former site of the city's most bustling slaving centers, auctions and markets. You see on the left, on the right side of this image, you see the Capitol. On the far right, you see the Washington Monument on the new model. This is the McMillan 1902 map. And the redesign of this particular area, I think, is motivated to submerge the racial history that carried on in this area, and we'll see that. As the current Senate debates about DC statehood and HR 40, a proposal for task force reparations, now in Congress, continues a political apartheid that has governed the nation unspoken since 1705. A close-up of that image. You see the Central Market, you see the White House, that Central Market, and we'll talk about Lafayette Park, slave auctions, you see the Capitol. Within 100 feet of where the Capitol is, you see the slave tent, the slave city where the men, women, and children, 600 of them who were enslaved and built the Capitol. And you see the Roby Williams slave down on the bottom, slave auction, which is across the street from the Hirshhorn, and we'll see that here in a second. A different picture, but the same image. This is one of the earlier ones of the Congo of America. So this was a 1830 probably image. You have the Capitol, you have the Washington Monument, where it's going to be, you have the White House, you have Lafayette Park way at the top. Lafayette Park was a bustling center, and Michelle Obama makes a reference to it, but it was once a slave auction, it was an auction camp. Right now it holds a statue of Andrew Jackson in it, which is also interesting. It was so called the Congo because of the number of enslaved persons exploited in the building of the city. Central commercial market of the enslaved, Lafayette Park, and you see where it's located. The building of Washington required the importation of so many highly skilled blacks that the district was known as the Congo of America. Lafayette Park was a central destination for slavers. That's Andrew Jackson's statue in the center. At one point, this was a cemetery. At one point, it was an auction. At one point, it was a market. Part of my sense of the redevelopment, the rebuilding of so much of this is to evacuate the history, as all the histories do, that you cannot read any of these histories. Rarely will you ever see the word slaver, enslaved, enslaved. You just don't see that. It is as if none of that ever happened. On the bottom left, you see the Neal House, a house on Independence Avenue now, not far from the Constitution of the Capitol in the background. And on the right, you see the Birch Home and Enslavement, which was on Duke Street. It later became the place, the major thoroughfare for enslavement north and south. The black slave market in the Washington, D.C., you can, just by looking at the image of it and the number of places that were used to buy, sell, and take care of those who enslaved persons. President Obama, 300 feet from where he stood, the excavations of the slave camp, of the persons who lived and died building the Capitol building. Another 3 blocks the different direction, the St. Charles Hotel, formerly the Capitol Hotel, 3rd in Pennsylvania, popular accommodation for slave traders. It advertised below its first-rate restaurant that guests could avail themselves of 6 30-foot-long arched slave cells, wall rings, and shackles. The management promised, quote, in case of escape, full value for the Negro will be paid. Roby's slave pen. If you've seen the film 12 Years a Slave, that's where this one is featured. You see the Capitol in the background. You see the auction. You see on the right side, you see the kid, the child, the woman, and the man holding him. You see a white man holding the black man on the other side. You see the white man who has his hands on what looks like hands on the enslaved person, basically because that's what they could do. They could do what they could do because they could. So it's on. This is 1835 on what's now Independence Avenue and 7th Street, the current home of the FAA, across from the Hirshhorn. 12 Years a Slave, a free black man from Boston is lured to Washington, D.C., where he is kidnapped, sent to Roby's slave pen, then shipped to Alexandria, Duke Street. Okay. The memorial you see on the left is in front of the FAA building. Okay. The justification used by the enslaver, this is the Constitution. No person held with service or labor in one state, this is the Constitution, under the laws thereof, escaping to another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor. Okay. So in other words, the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 mandated that anyone could be deputized to return an escaped slave to her or his owner. The enslaved person, if they did not have some form of paper, they did need proof. So the persons were picked up off the street, as Solomon Northrop was. So he was enslaved for 12 years under the authority of the US Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Act. And he later wrote his own story about that. The Hirshhorn, from where the picture is taken, image is taken, would have been Roby's Slave Tavern, right across the street. So this is from the film 12 Years a Slave. This is where the man would have been taken to. The image on the right is, again, the famous slave pen. in which hundreds of thousands of persons over 30 years went through. All right, here we come back to I've alluded to this. On July 9th, 1846, Alexandria returned a formal part of Virginia, so that DC, the part that had been Virginia, returned to Virginia, because by 1846, it was becoming evident that DC was going to end the domestic selling and buying of enslaved persons. And this is in 1850. They were not going to end enslavement itself in the district, just that you couldn't, it's like you couldn't buy or sell an enslaved person in the District of Columbia. So in 1846, Alexandria, Virginia, which was making its money on its product now, which was not cotton, which was not sugar, but enslaved persons, and at the harbor, said, nope, we're going back to Virginia. Carry me back to Virginia. So here we begin to see, while owners were compensated for enslaved persons were not. So between the ravages of the war and the DC Emancipation Act, immigrant crisis developed, and I call them immigrant because these were stateless persons. We must remember that between Dred Scott decision, which was one of the most astonishing decisions of the Supreme Court, which has still not been addressed. We'll talk about that in a minute. Between 1857 and probably 1871, a Black American had no legal recourse. They weren't citizens, they weren't states, they had no citizenship. The grounds of the Arlington Cemetery were, from 1863 to 1888, a self-sustaining village for former enslaved persons called the Freedmen's Village. That is to say, these were folks who were, and we'll talk about them as contraband. They were escaped enslaved. Lincoln's military maneuver of emancipation, which basically was because the North was losing the war, they wanted to have the enslaved persons from the South leave and come north to help the Northern battle, that if they did so, they would be freed. That was the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation does not, as we know, free out any of the enslaved in the North. It frees enslaved in areas that Lincoln did not have any responsibility or legal right to. And Lincoln is a complicated man, and he did not think as a president he had the authority under the Constitution to eliminate slavery. And he's a little bit like Jefferson. He was, I mean, they're all persons of their time, and if these persons were going to be freed, they had to be colonized from the American Colonization Society in 1807 back to their homes in Africa. The point that I made again before, that most of these persons are second, third, fourth, fifth generation Black Americans. They're not imported. Sojourner Truth meets with Lincoln to talk about the plight of slaves freed, escaped from southern states. They were called contraband, a funny maneuver by Northern military that an enslaved person, formerly enslaved person, or an escaped person would come to the military would claim them as contraband or spoil. So they were still property in an odd sense. They were contraband. And Washington, D.C. had a number of contraband camps, which we will see here like now. It's interesting to know what Lincoln knew and when, because Lincoln himself goes through lots of change over the issue of enslavement. And while he was against enslavement as a younger attorney, he wasn't too strong on the case. He did say about the war between the states, if I had to free the enslaved to preserve the Union, I would do that. If I had to keep the slaves enslaved to preserve the Union, I would do that. So the issue of the enslaved persons were not initially his major sense. DC passed the Compensation Act in 1862, 8 months before his Emancipation Proclamation. At one point, in his first inaugural address, he actually argues for amendment that would actually make enslavement unremovable. So you may know Lincoln's Cottage, and he went back and forth from the White House up to Lincoln's Cottage, which is in the old soldier's home. What you're going to see here, this is the Logan Circle area, all right? This was an area where you had two specific contraband camps. The bottom right image is Barker Constant. It's Garrison School and it's Barker contraband and the excavations that they're doing. These were escaped enslaved who were held here. I don't want to call them camps, but they were actually guarded enclosures where they were kept as contraband. Were they free? They were free, but they were contraband. So the question is that as Lincoln would go up and down the South of the up down to DC, you'll begin to see as we look at some of the maps of DC here in a few minutes, is that he passes through what will later become very segregated areas and areas that have seen since become largely Black and persons of color. While we're on the topic of Lincoln, Douglas, at the installation of the Emancipation Memorial, which was paid for by emancipated, manumitted enslaved, not by anybody else. So Douglas, who never minced words, shows the Negro on his knee when a more manly attitude would have been indicative of freedom. Some interesting things here. We're going to see that the monument depicts Lincoln holding a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, which again was a military gesture, nothing else, freeing a male slave modeled. The ex-slave is depicted on one knee, and there's an image that we're going to come to, because this is modeled after something else. That this was a very famous image that went through abolitionists, and it was in 1787. The Emancipation Memorial hints at this image also, and you see it on any number of the abolitionist material. The memorial is under current police observation since the killing of George Floyd. I was there this weekend. The sign has been removed, but it was very recently that it was. The Emancipation, a copy in Boston is going to be removed, and I should come back to this over here. That Eleanor Norton has announced plans to introduce legislation to remove the Emancipation Proclamation. She did this on June 23rd, 2020. She says the statute fails to note how enslaved African Americans pushed for their own emancipation. She quotes, "Understandably, they were only recently liberated from slavery and were grateful for any recognition of their freedom. However, in his keynote address at the unveiling of the statute, Douglas also expresses displeasure with the statute, as we have seen." Who built the city? Probably persons who never profited from it. So the part of the archaeology that we're doing this afternoon, very quickly, and I do apologize for this, for having to race through so much of a very deeply meant history of this town. Who built this place? It was built on land ceded to the federal government by Virginia and Maryland. We've been through that. And slaves were most likely involved in all aspects of construction, not only capital, buildings, streets, and landmarks. And I look around it. I look at RFK Stadium, and I look at John Kennedy, this, and I look at that, and I go, what? Even the names. Frederick Douglass gets a bridge. And of course, the land was removed from the ancestral usage of the Piscataway and other indigenes. So it should come as no surprise that slave laborers, mostly Black, but indigenous as well, were used to build the nation's capital and the federal district. Slaves appear to have shouldered alone the grueling work of sawing logs and stones from the Aquia quarry in what we now call Stafford. And one of the earliest shots of Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House, this is 1830. Enslaved persons built or marched in chains and shackles down the avenue where Congress and the presidents conducted its business. The Capitol before being burnt by the British in 1814. The British had come in and had burned the Capitol. This is a vision of the Capitol after the British burned it in 1814. And why I talk about the burning of it is because it had to be rebuilt. And here's the image in 1846 that it was rebuilt by the enslaved with its copper dome, which itself is going to catch fire. And so in 1856, they're going to start over again. 1856, 1858, the Capitol under Reconstruction. Enslaved probably still worked on this project at this particular time. In fact, the Statue of Freedom that is that sits at the pinnacle of the Capitol was designed and manufactured and built by an enslaved man, Philip Reed, who never saw it when it got finished, but would have been freed in 1863. So who were these men, these women, these children who labored here? What happened to them preparing for the first Lincoln inaugural? The western balcony of the Capitol, where Barack Obama takes his oath of office in 2009, is the location of the tent city that housed the Black builders of the US Capitol. At least 400 of the 600 carpenters, masons, artisans, skilled laborers, more than 2/3 were enslaved Black Americans. This is the man, the enslaved man, Philip Reed, South Carolina, who cast the model. It sits atop the Capitol Dome. It was completed in 1863 when Philip Reed, then free, did not know that. One of the things I talked about earlier was what I call soft power. And for the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of soft power. Various memorials and announcements and going back and doing work that seems to laud and say thank you and recognize. 2012, Congress unveils a marker to commemorate how important the role played by laborers, including enslaved African Americans, in building the state capitol. What they don't do, however, is take out the statues of, say, Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the majority in Dred Scott decision. So, which he is now gone. That happened this summer after George Floyd. Coming to the White House. The White House was built by slaves, the depressing but hopeful story. Not surprising that the construction site of the White House, the enslaved laborers were forced to witness all around them the trading and selling of other slaves. Across the street at Lafayette Square, the slave pens stood out in the open. All day long, human traffickers transported Blacks on horse-drawn carriages, ordered shackled men, women, and children into long chain-linked signs. In other words, the White House was erected by slaves in the midst of a slave bazaar. Michelle Obama. It's a story that I witnessed every single day. When I wake up in a house that was built by slaves, and I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful Black young women, head off to school, waving goodbye to their father, the President of the United States. Commencement speech in 2016, for which she got all kinds of yammer from all kinds of people. And in 1793, James Hobson, a revised model for the White House, he rented out his own enslaved persons to build and took the profit from them. This is 1793. Earliest known photograph of the White House, January 1848. President Polk brings his own enslaved persons as part of his personal property into the White House. Obama and the People's House, which is the name of the White House. The quote on the left is Roger Taney. If we do not know the Dred Scott decision, it's worth reading it. The Negro for more than a century before had been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. 1857. For my take, this was the instigation of the war between the states. The statue, the bust that you see is Roger Taney formally in the Congress because this summer he finally was removed. I still am astonished that that Supreme Court decision, along with Plessy versus Ferguson, have never been, nothing has been done with either one of them. So who were these men, children, women, who were mostly born in this city, this country, in this place? What happened to them? This is in the background, you see the unmarked grave at Mount Zion. These are the conditions of the people. And by the way, this is Georgetown. Okay. Holyrood Cemetery in Georgetown, the cemetery of the Trinity Church, the top left, top right corner, unmarked. the free burial ground. Here lie hundreds of parishioners of Holy Trinity who could not afford the price of burial, much less stone memorials, a euphemism for enslaved persons. Underground Railroad. Where did these people go? They started their journeys out of slavery by staying here. Fleeing Virginia, would have spent the night at the Mount Zion Cemetery before continuing north or west. The building that you're seeing here, which you can go over now and see, was very much, it was at the time, was a place for holding corpses until they could be buried. This is where the enslaved would stay. Not far from us in Olney, opening to an underground railroad complex, which is itself, and I know that Mr. Kellerman himself does work here, so he can take over in the next walking tour and do that with us. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. Harriet Tubman. This is a previously unreleased conceptual design of a new $20 bill that was produced by Engraving and Printing. It was completed in 2016. The Trump administration put the project on hold, and likely Tubman will not be on the bill. Where do they go? Where were they buried? Woodrow Wilson Bridge under construction, 2006. Freedman Cemetery in the left, right by the water, now covered with trees, completely unmarked. The people who remain. This is what was life, living within sight of the Constitution, of the Capitol. This is from the Southwest on both of these. 1948, Temple Alley, Temple Court. Dee and Delaware used to meet in Southwest. And you can see the Capitol not far in the distance. Ledroit Park, 1873. We look at it now and say, oh, how quaint. Little do we realize that this was a sign, and you can see the brickwork here, that there was fences, there was a wall, and this was an enclosure. This was a white gated community. Howard University, which borders it actually, the students were largely responsible for basically breaking this mark down. My husband and I lived in Ledroit Park for at least 7 or 8 years, about a decade ago. So at the dawn of the 20th century, African Americans had created a cultural intellectual capital. And you see here, we don't see much evidence of this unless you're really paying attention. But in 1919, at the end of the war, when the soldiers are coming back, and you have 1918, of course, is the first pandemic that we're still fussing with, and so the Washington had its first. I don't want to call it race riot. I'm not sure. I don't have a real name for it. I'd like to call it resistance. I'd like to call it no more. But that the number of persons who were killed and businesses who were destroyed. And you can, just by looking at the pictures you saw earlier, that whatever we might want to say about apartheid and segregation, Washington, D.C., lack of representation started with the lack of basics for persons of how they had to live. Riots again break out at National Capitol, Marines kill Negro. 2,000 troops in Washington, and of course, Woodrow Wilson is president at the time, and we'll see more about him in a minute. I want you to draw your attention to the map up on the left side very quickly. The purple is land that is restricted either by covenant or by law or personal petition from Black Americans. The brown was the only place in Northwest that persons of color or Black Africans, or Black Americans, excuse me, were able to use those distinctions differently, that a Black American and a person of color would be someone of a different ethnicity. So the brown would be where they, by law, could live. That again, the purple were by legal boundary by personal petition or by something in the seller's contract that forbade persons of color or Black people from living there. 1873, up here in the center, a place called Hell's Bottom. What I show this particular map is because this is the area that you're going to find that in 1868 then becomes in the assassination of Martin Luther King. Yeah, I'll come to that in a second. This is President Woodrow Wilson. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. This man was a president of Princeton. He was a president of the United States. He was president from 1913 to 1921, the race riots in 1919. This, by the way, this image was used in W.G. Griffith's The Birth of America. All right, the map over here, following the news of Martin Luther King's Jr.'s assassination on April 4th, 1968, they call it, race tensions, but it's resistance. We cannot live like this. We will not live like this. And if you look at the map of Washington, you see it's 14th Street and 7th Street, up and down both of those corridors. And many of the mostly Black areas that were destroyed took decades to recover and are still recovering. The map on the left shows you 7th Street and O Street. Segregation in the United States was strictly enforced, but is also ingrained in culture and society. The map we saw earlier, again up in the upper right, the purple area are restricted by covenant from persons who are Black or other persons of color from living there. That only so the area that is largely brown would be the area that we now call Columbia Heights. The area in the bottom map that is kind of aquamarine blue would have been by petition, that owners would petition that their land be reserved to white. And so you could see in the upper left, the maps, 1990, 2000, 2006, and contemporary, how policy of excluding persons from the Northwest, partly law, but also then partly custom. So we began with district markers and we end with social apartheid. And let's remind myself that this is an archaeology of persons and not of buildings. Sundown towns, white only after dark. Probably most of us have heard of these. Towns, well, we just saw them. We just saw Washington, D.C., that parts of it are restricted by law, by covenant, by personal petition, that certain towns had specific laws about banning persons of color, Black Africans, Black Americans, from either one living there or being in there, depending on the state, and these were not all necessarily in the South. Now, right? You see here in red, list of towns in Maryland. The towns in red had laws either governing property or presence for Black Americans. Brentwood, Chevy Chase, Greenbelt, Mount Rainier, University Park, what we would call now with the university as the University of Maryland. Greenbelt, Mount Rainier, town of Chevy Chase, all had laws restricted who could live, where they could live, whether they could even be in the town after dark. So essentially what you're seeing is that while Black Americans may have had a 70% population in the District of Columbia, they weren't allowed in any of the towns in the area around. And this is as recent as 1990. To remind ourselves, of course, that this is not simply about one kind of person and it's not limited to one country. The white only after dark is a Darien, Connecticut sign, actually, and the population there was Jewish. Sometime read Frederick Douglass's biography. He was approached by what they would call a slave breaker who was going to break him. I guess as you would break a horse, an odd expression. And Douglass beat him so badly and said, the only way you're going to break me is if you kill me. So Douglass, again, who was smarter than most of the people around him, he eventually becomes the Marshal of the District of Columbia. And you see in the middle, Fred Douglass, the point confirmed, like for some reason I can never call him Fred, but he's on the district judiciary. Goodbye, Columbus. Goodbye, Judge Taney. So you begin to see a lot of scurrying of action around trying to take care and remedy our history and change it. And on the left, you see the Baltimore statue of Columbus being taken at night and dumped into the sea. And you see Judge Taney's being removed from the Capitol just this summer. And why Columbus? In 1495, Columbus returns to Spain with 5 ships of Captus Indigene islanders who were later transported enslaved to various colonies. That from 1495 until 1619, which technically begins the Black African enslavement in Jamestown, that for that 125 years, the large population of enslaved were indigenous. And you wonder about Taney. Well, it's enlightening to read the Dred Scott decision. Very depressing. We're coming to an end of my remarks here, and I want to come back to, I mentioned earlier that Virginia had Virginia laws around, the colonial laws around enslavement tended to be ad hoc. That as more and more persons of color, more and more Black Americans began to be more and more indigenous and even Irish, and after the 1650 wars, Irish Brit Wars, were brought to Virginia. They did not have a category for knowing what to do with these particular persons. And the word slave and the word indentured, these kinds of words would be used indeterminately back and forth. They gradually became harder and harder and formalized it more as the population of non-white became a majority. Virginia is the first colonial to have what I would call apartheid. 1705 made white the legal definition of citizenship. That no longer would you be called an Englishman, no longer would you be called a Christian, no longer would you be called a European. That white is the first time that it appears in law. John Punch, an African man regained by his master, is brought to Virginia as an indentured servant. He escapes with 2 European servants. And this was the great fear that the Europeans and the African enslaved would get together and somehow gang up on the masters. The 3 men were returned to their owner, former owner. The 2 Europeans were given 3 years additional sentence on their on their enslavement, if you want to call it, or their indenturedness. John Punch, an obviously made up name, was given life tenure enslavement. John Punch, and this is in 1636. This is the first time in the colonies that you see that expression life enslavement appear. And gradually over the next 30, 40 years, enslavement laws will begin to borrow from the Caribbean colonial laws and harden up. In 1636, the Virginia Slave Code defines white as a legal line to citizenship. If you were not white, if you were mixed race, if you were mestizo, if you were in any kind of one drop, that's where this comes from, you would be below the threshold for citizenship. But Mr. Punch has a surprising descendant, and you might see it here. This particular child with his mother. Um, 2012, recent DNA suggests that Obama's biography, and Obama's biography, he was kind of whitened up in public that, well, he really didn't have enslavement in his family. Well, he did, as a matter of fact. He's the son of a Black father from Kenya, a white mother from Kansas. It's long suggested that unlike most African Americans, his roots did not include slavery. It's not so. He was descended from John Punch, from the first African enslaved for life in America by law that is legally recognized. He's descended through her, the white mother, not through his kin and all that. But she has John Punch's DNA. Justice and the question of reparations. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau, shortly after the war between the states, led by Mr. Howard, and they incorporate Howard University, which was the first formal chartered act of reparations. And much of its early funding came from endowment and private benefaction. But to this day, it receives yearly benefits from Congress to sustain. The building on the right, the Minor Hall, which you could still see over in there, was the first normal school for color girls, as they called it at the time. The story of segregation. Shaw Junior High, segregated by law. One of the 5 cases that formed the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, was the state of legally segregated schools in the District of Washington. So all the fine work around, well, you know, they're the cultural capital of the world, and they run the city of DC. They were segregated here as in anywhere else. And so Bowling versus Sharp was one of the 5 cases that was decided in 1954. Bowling versus Sharp, Washington, D.C. Grievance. Black students segregated in overcrowded schools, denied admission to new, well-equipped schools for whites only. This court was denied by a D.C. court before it was moved on to the Supreme Court. So it was from 1949 to 1967 before the ramifications of that case were settled. 6-year-old child being escorted by FBI. Thank you this afternoon for being with me as we've walked through very quickly this. Faulkner says the past is not even dead. Past is not past, it's not even dead. We think about present politics. We think about John Lewis at the Pettus Bridge in 1965, who died just a few months ago. And you can see Martin Luther King and Representative Lewis here and the work that they were doing and the work we are still continuing to do. 21st Amendment in 1961. And whenever you see that particular shape, remember that the shape of Washington, D.C. reminds us that this is an enslaved place. The people who lived here and still live here wear chains. And the Southern politics controlled the legislation around slavery, kept all citizens outside of legal representation. A Republican-controlled Senate this year refused to hear the D.C. Statehood Act pressed by the House. What do you think the reason is? Why does D.C. not have representation? William Buckley argues, white Americans are entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally anywhere they are outnumbered because they are part of the advanced race. And then there's Electoral College. Talk about suppression of votes. James Madison, we're going to end where we started with Hamilton. Madison writes, there was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature, attending an immediate choice of the people. He's being wordy here, saying one of the reasons we don't want to have direct representation. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the North than in the Southern states, and the latter could have no influence in election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to fewest objections. Clinton's parting commentary to the district 200 years later, DC residents still exist as stateless persons, black and white. Back to Georgetown. To offset some of the damage, in 2016, the university provided preferential administration to the descendants of the slaves who had been sold. Should they have done that? I think so. Should we entertain the notion of the HR 40, which talks about a task force, at least for some kind of reparations, that together we walk in a place that has shadows. We are part of the shadows ourselves, that every one of us is involved in a past that is not dead, it's not even past. In 1970, the Black population peaked at over 537,000 people, 71% of the city's population. By then, many white residents had moved to the suburbs of Maryland and Virginia, where they enjoyed full voting rights. In 1790, Blacks were 25% of the population. In 1800, and the majority of them were enslaved. The 51st state is a bill before Congress. If the Senate flips, it's likely to be passed. DC lives do matter. This would be the state of Washington, the Douglas Commonwealth. I want to thank you this afternoon for what's a very quick overview of a situation. And any part of this, once you start digging into it, once you start unscrubbing history, not only here, but other places, and our own history, we find a whole new particular lives. And we find ourselves that once we know the facts, what do we have to do with them? I want to thank you for being part of a solution, and thanks for your patience. And any errors here are my own. Audre Lorde says, our silence will not protect to us. If we become a state, we'll be the District of Columbus, the Douglas Commonwealth. My last slide this afternoon is, this is what is now on DC's trolley tours, things to do with children. So again, we are still straightening up in public for this. Much of the information that I have is probably derived from the books Black Men Built the Capitol and The Hidden History of Washington, D.C. Rob, Mr. Kellerman will have my contact information. I'll be glad to have a conversation, or if people want references to things to read or what to do, what to see, and how to go about doing this, I'll be very happy to help you to have that kind of exploration. And Robert, I think it's all yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ed. That was incredibly moving. So I know you were speaking, you didn't get a chance to see the comments, but I'll kind of summarize a lot of them. Most of them were thanking you for the great presentation. A lot of them had to do with things like, wow, this is really difficult to sit and listen to this history, important to sit and listen to, but difficult nonetheless. And I think a lot of people were commenting on things along the lines of, they were familiar with stuff that you brought up, but they didn't know the historical context of it. And it was really shocking to a lot of people to kind of fill in the gaps, because you mentioned a few times in your presentation, it seems like some of these things have been erased over time, maybe oftentimes on purpose, because it is difficult to see. But no, thank you so much. That was really incredible. So for those of you listening, we are recording this presentation, and if all goes well, we'll put it on our Facebook and YouTube page. I'm pretty confident that'll happen, but I'm not 100% sure, because every once in a while we're at the mercy of technology and we have hiccups. But if you joined us late or want to listen to this again or know someone that might be interested, we are recording it. And so we will try and put it on our Facebook and YouTube page. If I get it, I'll try and do that ASAP, and I'll send out an email with that information along with Ed's contact information if you want to catch up with him at some point in the future. Ed, do you have any time to answer any questions? We had like over 700, we had over 760 people connecting on Zoom today. So thanks for all your interest, and thanks for
I'll sit here.
All your knowledge.
I'll sit here to answer any questions as long as anybody wants.
Okay, terrific. So let's see, there's quite a few. But again, thanks everyone for joining us. We had a great turnout today, so that was very flattering and great to see. Just off the top of my head, someone asked about, did Virginia and Maryland get anything for giving up the territory that became Washington, D.C.? Like, were they compensated in any way, the states?
They got their land, and most of the people who gave away the land lived where they were, so they kept the profits from the land and its place in the capital. So they got a kind of recognition.
Oh, I see. Okay. That was one question. Do the questions and the Q&A pop up at your end?
Virginia get any money? No, they did not, but they got the owners obviously were compensated, because the owners sold the land. So there was a map in here that I actually did not choose to use because I had to move on, but it had the original owners, a map of the properties in Georgetown and Virginia.
Okay. Let's see. What about someone asked, TLB, can you speak more about your statement that after 1710, most blacks were second, third, fourth generation?
Can I speak more about it? Is that by the time of the passing of when Congress outlawed the international slave trade in 1808, but by 1760 and 1770, probably most enslaved persons, were likely second or third or fourth generation. There are books that have the statistics, and I mentioned a couple of them, and one is the domestic traffic. One of them is carrying back to Old Virginia. So there is actual work if people want to do that. But other than the fact that probably most of the persons in the last 2 centuries that we know that we would call African American are not African, they're American, they're Black American.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, that's the point that I would, Rob, that's the point that I would make, that we talk about African American, but we do not talk about Asian American, or we sometimes talk about Asian American, but we do not talk about European American, which goes silenced. So I don't use either expression unless I use all three of them at the same time.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see. Yvette asked a question. This was from quite a while ago, early in the presentation. Where did you get the list of enslaved shown to be transported south?
Any standard survey of, you can Google it, any standard survey, and I had it in my notes, but I couldn't, I had one slide that had all the presidents. Just Google either Wikipedia or the Britannica, presidents who own slaves.
Okay. Someone asked, let's see, Margaret, did John Adams own slaves?
No. John Adams actually was the one who used this Constitution in court to free the enslaved that had been taken off of a Spanish pirate's boat. And he says, because enslavement is not mentioned in the Constitution, we cannot hold them.
Okay. And then this is also a question from pretty early in the presentation from Melody. If Jefferson had racist supremacist views of enslaved Africans, why did he hire and trust Benjamin Banneker to survey the city?
He just did. I mean, he did. I mean, it was mostly George. It was more, I wouldn't call him that he had racist tendencies. I mean, the Banneker-Jefferson correspondence and the letter, Jefferson constantly came back to Banneker and used him as a, I don't want to say some of my best friends are gay or some of my best friends are this or some of my best friends are, but he would very often use Banneker as an example of the kind of Negro that he was hoping we would find more of.
Yeah, so, you can still be racist and have racist employees, right, or associates or
right,
business partners and stuff like that.
And I understand that. But my point is, it's not a word that he would use. I don't like to use that. He would talk about other ethnicities, but he rarely, because he was cagey. He would not get into. If you want to read the notes on Virginia, which is a short document, but that will tell you all you want to know about what Jefferson felt like about other races. He was very cagey about talking about, and he says that, he said, these two races cannot live together because the differences that nature has made, he doesn't specify what those differences are, and the culture has made. And he does say, if they did live together, there would be extermination.
Okay. And then here's a question from Dawn. Where's the quarry located at in Washington, D.C.?
Stafford. There's two. Aquia Quarry, where the White House comes from, is Stafford, Washington, Stafford, Virginia. And there's one in Maryland for the Smithsonian. It's near Olney, Maryland.
Let's see. And then here's a question from Sue. Not sure if you know the answer to this. Why did Franklin and Armfield change their name to Price Birch? Was that an ownership change?
Ownership change.
Okay.
And by the way, Bob, if I can move back to the thing.
Oh yeah, sure.
I think simply Googling a Maryland quarry for enslaved stone will find it. These are not, it's not hidden as much as it's been deflected. So you can find the information. You don't have to dig very far to find it.
Let's see, here's a question from Dave. Where and how did the skilled laborers get their training? Were their foremen also enslaved?
Yes. In fact, the man who oversaw the what do you call it, the freedom statue, the architect who was commissioned to do it died. And so Reed was somebody that they simply pulled in because they had nobody else who would know how to do this.
Hold on, let me scroll through some of these. So there's quite a few people there asking. I'll kind of summarize a bunch of different people's questions and put them together. That has to do with not do you think that the Jefferson Memorial and the Lafayette statue, or the Andrew Jackson statue in Lafayette Square across the street, not do you think they should be removed, but do you think they ever will? So not your personal opinion, but do you think it'll ever get to a point where, oh yeah, we're going to go take down the Jefferson Memorial or reconfigure it or do something like that? And then same thing with the Lafayette Square statue of Jackson.
I would not be surprised if Andrew Jackson's is moved. I would not be surprised if Lincoln's is moved. I think that Shannon Lanier's, and he's not the only one. No, we're not going to. I don't think we should throw this. I don't think these statues should come down and thrown away. That if we are going to have a revision to our history, or at least to an archaeology of our history, that's the way I would frame it, not a revision as much as an archaeology. That in some ways very much like the Vietnam statuary in and around the mall, where you have 2 or 3 different statues or congregations of persons that represent different approaches to the history, because no one of these histories is any more true than the other. What I'm finding in, say, the Macmillan Plan, that simply eviscerates most of them all, and then eliminates that, and you don't ever see that in the middle of any kind of the planning. You don't ever see that. Is that the things that are being uncovered or that are being put away, they're never really talked about them at all. So I don't think that these statues are, for the moment, kind of going to be Taney's. I would rather, and I said this actually to universities where I teach ethics, I would rather we keep the statues and change the curriculum. That is to say, I teach a course called European Continental Tradition of Ethics. And I'm going, keep the statues, but change the curriculum. There's no reason we need to be, when we talk about diversity, and we don't understand what we're talking about. We use the word diversity, we have no sense of that. And to walk into an all-black class on the 4th of July and say happy celebration of 4th of July. I think of Frederick Douglass's comments on that. What's it to us on that? So I said keep the statues, make it evident, put them someplace if you're going to leave them where they are, but do what they do, what is beginning to be done in Washington D.C. in terms of the Roby's pen across the street from the Hirshhorn. At least acknowledge that this shadow exists.
Okay, very good. And then someone asked if you're familiar with the old Bayou Bar, and was that used as a place that they sold slaves long ago? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Did it go by another name?
I don't know, Deirdre, does that go by another name? So we'll come back to that one.
Bayou sounds Louisianian. I don't know that, or Alexandrian. Nothing in DC, and I know a lot in DC. But the 2 books that you see on the screen, if you want the 2 most books specific to this kind of archaeological information, these would be the books to find it.
Yeah, so I can tell the audience listening that I have the book on the left, and I'm very familiar with it, and I do think it's an excellent resource. I have not read the one on the right, but I can definitely vouch and give a second recommendation on the one on the left. I will
say also, Robert, that much of this is that these 2 books are, I don't want to say outdated, but you find all kinds of, there's just layers upon layers upon layers of new information that's been coming out, and it's not. We're in a situation where the history of Washington, D.C. is changing. And it will change as soon as it becomes a state.
And then a number of people are saying something to the effect of, this was fascinating. I'd like to learn more. When is part 2 going to be?
Robert, it's like you tell me.
Maybe we work on, they want a sequel.
I already do 12 to 16 hours of lectures on this topic. Anyway,
Okay,
talk.
we'll figure out something. Let's see.
Okay. Tell them to go down to the CVS on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown and look at the brick in the back of the building.
See that? Okay. Let's see. A number of people are comment about the unhappy about the condition of the cemeteries and type stuff, and asking what they can do about that. I guess you would just have to find out who's responsible for that particular property and contact them.
The one of them the map there is the Holy Rood Cemetery, which is the tradition. The Mount Zion. It is a point that there were 5 mostly all Black Methodist churches in Georgetown, and when you stop and think about it, you go, why are they all here? So right there is an archaeology of history, and we didn't actually talk about the bones of the enslaved house in Washington and Georgetown, but that Georgetown itself was the 1950s gentrification of Washington or Georgetown was exactly another way to hide this past. But Mount Zion is an interesting, unfortunately interesting, very moving cemetery to walk through.
Okay, let's see. Okay, well, I think that might do it. Let's see.
I do want to end, as I said, while Robert is looking, to acknowledge all the lives who made this land before us and whose shadows we walk. I think it's significant to understand that we cannot walk anywhere on this in this marginal land of Virginia and Maryland without having another. And this is, I think, pretty much the case anywhere in the continental United States. We are here at some sufferance, and it's not ours.
Someone asked, what happened to the cemetery at Georgetown University? Were slaves buried there or only clergy?
Right now, so far as I know, my Georgetown background, there are no enslaved persons buried there.
Let's see. So a number of people are also posting links to stuff that is kind of a similar topic. So what I could do is, when we're done, I can put those together and email those out to the group. So I would say 4 or 5 people have posted links to different things. So I can thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. I can put those together.
I will give you 4 or 5. If you really want to change your life, as the German poet, du musst dein Leben ändern. If you want to change your life, I will give you 4 books on African-American, so-called African-American history. That should be mandatory reading.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
And these are history books to go back. One is Black over White over Black, opinions about Black Americans from 1550 to 2020, or something like this.
Okay.
Jordan. And Jefferson, just read anything Jefferson wrote, and you can get the point.
Okay. Let's see. Someone asks about the classes you teach at Georgetown, and then also too, there was a couple of questions about how did you get involved or interested in this topic?
Do we have time for this?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. we still have a lot of people logged. We still have a few hundred people logged on, so I guess they're wanting more.
A gay man growing up in a Catholic church whose history is always erased. Then being at Georgetown, where that's erased in terms of the economy. Married to a man who also is very much, I've lived in DC since I started teaching at Georgetown in 1986, and it's hard to walk down the block without seeing a kind of history. Most recently teaching courses on ethics to, I'll say it, largely persons of color and Black, I use expressions differently, largely women, largely Islam, and having to make sense out of European continental ethics. is a short. A lot of my studies is in animal rights and animal culture and animals and justice. I teach courses in the Faith and Justice Department. For years at American Studies, I was teaching courses in popular culture and looking at identity and how that's framed, not only from the point of view of, as a gay man, but how commodity culture shapes how we think about things. And that language like diversity and, that the United States was never an experiment in diversity. The very first legal apartheid in the United States was the first Naturalization Act in 1790, the first Congress that said immigration shall be limited to white persons of good manners, good morals. This is the 1790 immigration law. So the United States was never about diversity. What it has become and what we are making it. But in order to do that, we need to go back to that map of DC and look at that shape and remember the shadow on the District of Columbia. And what we do with that is going to be our business.
What about, this is a little bit off the tangent, partially. Are there any like museums or sites around the DC metro area that you feel like do a good job of talking about this history, whether it's, the African American Museum from the Smithsonian or Mount Vernon, or it's like?
They're all bits and they're all pieces. You have to go to a lot of different places. I mean, the Jefferson Foundation for years denied any of this. So now they go, the now Monticello goes back over the other way to talk about this and to clean it up and to, what they say, get ahead of the narrative. So you can see little bits and pieces everywhere.
I distinctly remember many years ago watching an episode of 60 Minutes where they were talking about the Thomas Jefferson controversy. And I've tried to find videos of it, but I've never seen any. And I distinctly remember the folks from there, oh no, Thomas Jefferson, he would have never done anything like that.
Well, Shannon Lanier, Robert Shannon Lanier he's a newscaster in Houston, and he's the great grandson, and he's written a book, of an American family on the Jeffersons. You can go to YouTube and just kick up the short history of Sally Hemings, like all YouTube sorts of things. And there's, any documentary, including this one, mine, has a point of view, and that should be fairly evident what my point of view in particular is. And it's our viewers' job to go and find their own point of view. But you can go to, none of this stuff is, when I say change the curriculum, none of this stuff is taught this way. For example, I quote, and I don't quote it in this particular one, but I quote a number of American studies when de Tocqueville says, "Oh, the European is to the black man as man is to the animals." He simply eliminates them from any kind of agency at all. Now, this is de Tocqueville. He's the classic in American studies, but you never get that in school. You don't ever get Jefferson's Notes on Virginia in school.
It's edited.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, well, let's see, again, there's lots of people posting links about different interesting things. So might take just a little bit of time to go through some of those and put them all together. But yeah, thanks for people that posted questions and comments and links and information. I'll put those together.
As I said, when you get your list together, I will also give you, and I'll be limited, but I will try and give you the 4 or 5. And they're not contemporary. They're not How to Be a Racist. They're not How to Not Be Racist. They're not Case, which are both very good books and are important. These are books on the history here that I'm talking about. This is not how we live with this history particularly now, but it's like, but if you want to know the law, if you want to know what Jefferson did on what date and to whom and why, the issue, for example, of Banneker and Jefferson, if you want to read the history, I can send you that book.
Okay. So let's see if anyone else has any questions. I might have missed a few from scrolling through earlier. This kind of last call for questions is that, use a bar terminology, last call.
Robert, let me propose something. One of the things that might actually be interesting is what I call slave nation, which I basically look at not Washington D.C., but the whole, basically the practicality and the materiality of being an enslaved person in colonies and in the States. So that's a 2-hour thing in and of itself.
What are you doing next weekend? I'll call you as soon as we're done to get a date.
some of it comes out of here. Some of it comes out of here.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there's some overlap.
Jefferson, the Jeffersons particularly. But for people who don't know, they asked me where, the pink, all of this came from a lecture that I was asked to give at the Hirshhorn about the pink triangle. And I go, well, they're asking me about a history of the pink triangle. You know what it is? Actually, it's a bloody brand. That's what the brand is.
Okay.
You heat it up and you stick it on somebody's. When Nathaniel Hawthorne, what he calls the Scarlet Letter, he prettifies it, but the brand is an actual brand. It's a triangle brand. That's why it's pink. Well, I showed a little bit of it today. The two collars, horses, mules, and dark black niggers. This is our history. It's 150 years ago, more or less, however many years.
Okay, let's see. Well, I think that will do it for the questions. So again, thanks everyone for joining, especially thanks you, Ed, for enlightening us. It was a very difficult history to listen to in many regards, but important to understand the context of how these things came about. And that was kind of a reoccurring theme that people had, like, gee, I'm familiar with such and such institution or place or emblem or whatever, but didn't know the history behind it. So I think you really did a great job kind of enlightening people on stuff that might have been lost over time, either intentionally lost, swept under the rug, or just for
what it was intentionally lost, Robert. And I'm sorry to have to capsulize everything in 2 hours, talking fast in an hour and a half. You really can't. I can't do justice to any of this.
Oh yeah, no. It was all good. So, okay, well, I think that will do it for this evening. Thanks everyone. Like I said, I'll follow up with the email and sometime in the next day or two with how to find the video and these other links and whatnot. And if you need anything else, just let us know. And thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. That was awesome. Bravo.
We will talk. Everyone, thank you. Please be safe. Take care of your health.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.